We really don't have a protein requirement. What we have is a requirement for amino acids. And we need to start treating amino acids like nutrients. We would never consider saying, well, I have a requirement for a vitamin pill. I have a requirement for 12 vitamins. Why do we say we have a requirement for protein when we don't? We actually require 9 essential amino acids and some organic nitrogen, amine groups, non-essential amino acid. And especially as we start talking about plant-based diets, we need to start really focusing on amino acids. Yeah, you go to a label or a food and type of, something that you see on a package, and they act like it's additive. They'll put a wheat cereal and they say add milk to it, and they just add those up to a total. And there's no way a wheat protein and milk are the same. I mean, it's, wheat protein, if it says it has 4 grams, the reality is it probably has less than 2, either because of bioavailability or poor amino acid content. So, it's just, if we all eat 120 grams of protein per day or more, it doesn't really matter. But when we go down the line of start talking about plant-based diets, the average consumer is going to get into trouble because they're going to decrease both the quantity and the quality at the same time. And the average consumer doesn't know what that means. The one that I study most is the branched-chain amino acid leucine. And we know that if you don't get adequate amounts of leucine at each meal, that muscle health will suffer. You will decrease both the mass and the strength over time. And for aging adults, that's a big issue. So we know that in people over the age of 40, they need about 3 grams of leucine per meal to maintain muscle health. People don't recognize, they talk about plant-based diets and people start talking about nuts and lentils and soy, but the reality is 80% of the plant-based protein in the world comes from wheat, and wheat is extremely unhealthy in the sense of amino acids. Lysine, methionine, leucine are all very low in wheat protein. Well, the most studied is clearly whey protein. Whey protein has almost 12% leucine by weight. Wheat, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, is 6.8%. Whey protein, it's available in very pure forms. It's water soluble and tastes pretty good. So researchers have used it because it's high leucine and also easy to work with. So that's probably the best. Meats come in at about just under 9% leucine, eggs a little over 9%, maybe 9.5%. So and fish are, similar to meats. So all of the animal proteins are 9 and up, and almost all the plant proteins are 8 and down. So if you look at milk total, which is, I forget again, I think it's 80% casein and 20% whey protein. I think milk in total comes out at about 9.5%. Whey protein is also water soluble and very rapidly digested. It's referred to as quick digesting, where casein is less soluble. Obviously, the whole difference between casein and whey is cheese making. When you put milk into an acid environment, you precipitate out casein, and that's cheese, and what's left over is the liquid, and that's whey. If you're trying to get a muscle protein synthesis with whey, you can do that with 23 to 25 grams of protein. If you do it with casein, you can get the same effects, but it's going to take 30 to 32 because of the slower curve. It digests slower. You can go to a plant-based diet, but you have to realize it always takes more total protein and more total calories to get the same effects. So Luc van Loon has done a lot of that research. He's in the Netherlands, and what he did was look at basically adding a 4th protein meal to the day at nighttime, and he used casein for exactly that same idea. But he was using about a 40-gram meal like an hour before sleep, and so they get a slow digestion, amino acids higher, and they did find that, again, by adding a 4th meal of that type of protein, the young athletes gain both mass and strength.
Would you say ideally, if this is someone who's really geared towards strength training and building muscle, that 4 spikes of muscle protein synthesis is sort of like the sweet spot?
That's generally where I would go if I was talking to an athlete really looking to build muscle. And I would I would center each of those around the leucine target. I think the first meal and then the later meals are the more important. The reality is nobody has really shown any real effect of lunch on muscle protein synthesis. We know that first meal is critical.
Yeah.
But the first meal, the hangover from the first meal lasts a long time, and we really don't know that the second meal has much effect. We know quite a bit about the third meal. So first and third, we know for sure. As you pointed out, there's some data about a fourth meal, but the reality is we don't know much at all about the second meal. You commented on 2 meals a day. That's kind of my pattern. I'm not interested in muscle building. I'm interested in muscle protection and sort of weight maintenance. And so I'm kind of controlling calories while I'm maxing my protein, sort of a cost ratio benefit. I think one has to realize that there would be an adaptation. So if you were a vegan having 20 grams per meal or less, and all of a sudden you took in 100 grams, chances are you wouldn't digest and absorb that very well. But if you get used to it over a period of a week or so, no one really has an upper limit for digestion. I mean, if you have a meal with 100 grams of protein in it, and it's something you've done sort of routinely, you're going to digest and absorb it all. You're not going to use it very efficiently. We think there's a sweet spot between 25 to 55, maybe 60, particularly in terms of muscle. Muscle, when you're young, develops really driven by hormones, insulin, IGF-1, testosterone, estrogen. All of the hormones drive growth up through 30. They're really important. Then you have sort of a sweet spot. After 40, now we know that those hormones really aren't helping you much anymore. They can't be deficient, but they're not really giving you much growth. And now we know the quality of protein becomes more important.
0.8 grams per pound of body weight. So
for muscle development, all the data suggests that's adequate.
Yeah.
It's adequate for aging. Some people might argue that there's reasons to have higher protein because you're trying to have lower carbs. So now you have another question. We were talking about muscle development, but if your goal is to reduce your carbs more by replacing it, then that's another reason to have a higher protein diet. So there may be multiple reasons, but not muscle development. The average American's eating close to 300 grams of carbs per day. The RDA for carbs is 130. Carbs are a great fuel for muscle, but only if muscle is active. And so the way I think about carbs is that the body has a need for about 90 to 100 grams per day of carbs. And then anything above that, you earn with muscle activity at a rate of maybe 60 grams per hour of exercise. So if you have an hour of exercise per day, you can have about 160 grams of carbs per day. If you eat 300 grams of carbs per day, then you need 3 hours of fairly intense exercise every day. And not too many Americans are getting that. Fruits and vegetables are natural forms of carbs that I think we should all be eating and probably eating more of. Grains, particularly wheat carbs, are where we're getting a lot of our carbs. And it appears that form of carbs from wheat flour is particularly dangerous in metabolism. Blood sugar is clearly toxic at some level. We call it diabetes. Insulin creates its own resistance. We looked at counting things, and people don't like to count things. They don't like to read labels. So we basically looked at how we would partition the plate into 3 sections. 1 section for protein, 1 section for fruits and vegetables, and 1 section for all of the starchy, sugary carbs, whether it's rice or pasta or breads or desserts, and even alcohol we put in that section, not really a carb, but empty calories. And basically, the way we teach it is that the visual size of the protein on your plate, the carb section can never be larger than that.
Okay.
So if you have a 5-ounce piece of meat, that translates to about a half cup of rice. We teach it as a protein-centric diet. So whatever you choose, if you choose to be an omnivore and eat meats, fine. If you choose to be a vegetarian and not eat meats, but you still base your meal around the protein amount. You pick your protein amount, and that determines your carb amount. One of the goals we wanted was to have a breakfast, a first meal of the day, where they would get to the lunch meal without having to have any snacks. We found that getting the protein in the 35-gram range, keeping the carbs less than the protein number, so 30 grams or less of carbs, and fat sort of in a moderate range, but we never went to fat-free products. And we always tried to keep the protein levels at least 35 grams or higher. Technically, why, it works, there's a lot of hormones, GLP-1, PYY, brain effects, vagal effects from the stomach. There's a lot of, gastric emptying rates. There's a lot of possible reasons why protein has higher satiety. We found that they would get a spike of blood sugar, a spike of insulin, and then they actually get a valley about 2 hours later. So we had a high carb group and a low carb group in our studies. People on the high carb group complained about being hungry about 2 hours after their breakfast, where the people on the higher protein, low carb didn't. And the protein range for me is, a low end of, somewhere around 60 grams. That would be a pretty strict vegetarian. That's probably enough to prevent any real deficiencies, up to an upper end of maybe 300 grams per day. I think that's totally safe within that range.
Okay.
We would like to try and get women to 100 grams, and we would like to try and get men around 130, 140. And again, we weren't dealing with bodybuilders. We were dealing with weight loss, healthy aging, and things like that. We realized that leucine and mTOR is a signal for recovery. And so whether it's an overnight fast or whether it's after exhaustive exercise, the body is catabolic, and it will stay catabolic until you eat protein. And so we started experimenting with taking in protein, and eventually we got down to it actually was leucine was the key. We found that the window for the biggest effect was about 2 hours, within 2 hours afterwards. Okay, so that's sort of acute recovery. Then there's a lot of research been done by Stu Phillips and other people who have looked at sort of the anabolic window. So now we need to step away from sort of an acute experiment and asking, how about training? Okay, this whole aspect of protein right after exercise, the biggest benefit of that is for an untrained individual. Once you become trained, if you've been doing the same exercise for 2 months, you're basically trained at that level, I see no real benefit to protein after exercise. Your next meal is fine. You and I talked about 3 meals per day or 4 meals per day. I don't really care where you place them. It's all going to be the same. Okay. But if you're going into a new exercise, you've been off summer vacationing and now you're coming back to football practice and you're going to do 2-a-days, I think protein right after exercise is probably a good recovery for the first couple of weeks. What exercise does is sensitize the muscle to the signals. It's a molecule called RED1. And basically what you're doing is inhibiting that and making the muscle more sensitive to protein. And by doing that, that's training, okay? And so again, if you're untrained, that's where we studied that protein effect right after exercise. If you're trained, it doesn't really matter. So after a meal, muscle goes into what would be an anabolic period. It's synthesizing more protein. And we always have 2 processes going on. One is synthesis and one is breakdown. You're continuously making new protein and breaking down protein. You and I, different ages, different body size, we both need to make 250 to 300 grams of new protein per day. So that's a lot more than we're eating, okay? So that's turnover. And the body is continuously reusing some amino acids. Okay, so we've got these two processes going on. Right after a meal, we have an anabolic process, high synthesis for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And then you go into a catabolic period where the body now in muscle is no longer synthesizing protein at a high rate. The breakdown is now becoming the higher rate. And the reason for that is the body has nowhere to store amino acids. And organs like the liver or the heart or the kidney need to make proteins 24 hours a day, whether you're eating or not. And so muscle, in essence, becomes a reservoir, and it begins to supply amino acids to the rest of the body. So during the nighttime where you eat dinner, and you might go 12 hours till your next meal, now you're going into a very catabolic period. You're basically breaking down protein to feed your liver and kidney and brain and everything else that needs to run. Muscle is supplying that. When you wake up in the morning, your body's going to stay catabolic, breaking down muscle protein until you eat a meal that has 30, 35 grams of protein, which is why that cereal and juice breakfast is so bad. Basically, it's high carbs, it's high insulin, it's high fat deposition, and yet you're still breaking down muscle for protein. And so that's why we think the first meal of the day is so critical. You need to have it low carb, high protein to restabilize metabolism.